On today's episode of Faith and Focus, I want to do kind of almost like a part two to an episode I did a few weeks ago, or a few episodes ago, I think it was a few weeks ago now, on the 70 Weeks of Daniel. It's kind of this prophetic passage in the book of Daniel that talks about this time period, predicting the coming of Christ, the first coming of Christ. But we didn't really delve into what's called the 70th Week of Daniel. So I want to talk about that in this episode and make the case for the fact that there is a literal 7-year period yet to happen, still in the future, that will immediately precede the second coming of Christ. And it's kind of an interesting topic that comes up in end times prophecy, so it's worth looking into and understanding. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Hey guys, if you've been a listener of Faith and Focus for a while and have enjoyed what you've been hearing, I would love it if you would consider becoming a monthly supporter of the ministry. As a missionary within faith, my work is entirely supported by listeners like you, who believe in the work God has called me to do, and podcasting is just a small part of that. I also teach the Bible at my local church, in the ministry house I live in, and with the young men God has put in my life to disciple. I also do biblical counseling that is entirely donation-based, so your monthly support goes in part to help support counseling sessions for people who may not be able to afford any or all of the cost of counseling. And with your monthly support, I would be able to go on to full-time ministry, which would include more podcast recording, new podcast ideas that we've had, and different forms of online teaching, as well as more availability for counseling sessions. If you'd like to become a monthly supporter, you can email me at dennissotheby@infaith.org or head over to infaith.com/Dennis-Sotheby. Thank you. Well, I remember in Bible school, prophecy was probably my favorite subject, and it was kind of just a interesting curiosity at the time. It was just very interesting to really delve into what the Bible had to say about the future. I loved the Left Behind books. It's kind of embarrassing to say that now. I mean, they're okay books, I guess, but I think their eschatology, their end times stuff leaves a little bit to be desired. But we'll leave that aside. And the movies, don't even get me started on the movies. But I don't really agree with a lot of what the Left Behind series has to say, but I do appreciate the literalness with which Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins they took the prophecies about the end times to be quite literal, and so they wrote books reflecting what they believed about it. But one of the things about prophecy and why I thought it was so interesting at the time was, again, it just kind of it scratched a intellectual curiosity, an itch that I had. And it was interesting, and that's kind of all it was to me, was a topic of interest, and so that's what intrigued me about it. I like to read a lot about it, but now looking back, I realize that I think that what I was intrigued by about prophecy is kind of what plagues a lot of people who speak about prophecy, and people who kind of could take it or leave it. They want nothing to do with prophecy, and I think it's because to most people, and to the people who hear it and don't want to hear about it anymore, that's all it is just an intellectual curiosity. It's sort of like navel gazing and just speculating about the future. It's maybe a biblical version of Nostradamus, where we're all kind of just guessing at what's going to happen. So why waste time? Everyone's opinions, there's as many opinions about what's going to happen in the end as there are people to have opinions. And so I think people either enjoy it because they can speculate endlessly and they enjoy that, or they hate it because that's all it is just endless speculation. Now, to be fair, there is some of that. a lot of it is just speculation. And I think that's why I liked it when I first started looking into it. But now I recognize if you can look at it from a mature point of view, it's incredibly amazing how detailed and accurate God's prophetic messages can be. And so they're worth looking into and recognizing how accurate they have been in the past, and then trusting how accurate they will be in the future. So this prophecy that I started talking about on the 70 weeks of Daniel, I'll link it in the show notes. You should go back and listen to that, because I do a lot of the explanation about what is meant by a week in Daniel chapter 9. And I'm not going to rehash all of that, so you need to go back and take a listen to that. But really, a week is just like what we would use the word dozen. To mean 12, but in Hebrew, this week just means a set of 7. And in the context of Daniel 9, it is a set of 7 years. So in that prophecy, there is 69 sets of 7 years. It shakes down to 473 years, and it predicts the first coming of the Messiah. But in that episode, we didn't talk about the remaining week. There was 70 sets of 7 years, and we only talked about 69 of them. And there is a remaining week. So the Left Behind series takes place over the tribulation, the Great Tribulation, and it happens within a 7-year period. And so people who take end times prophecy literally are anticipating a literal 7-year period. And the reason why that's important is because that's the way we look at this is kind of the distinction between people who view prophecy almost as just like vague, spiritual. 7 is the number of completion and perfection. So really this is just a period of time that's like a perfect period of time, kind of vague spiritual numerology. Or it's the difference between that or somebody who would interpret this quite literally and as expecting and anticipating a period in the future of 7 years where certain things are going to happen. And so I want to make the case that is a literal 7 years. The Left Behind series is right in that regard. And a lot of preachers who talk about a 7-year tribulation and a future great tribulation, and they speak about it as if it's 7 years. That's what we're going to look at in this episode and kind of explain where they get that from. So I've already referenced the passage in Daniel 9, but the end part of that prophecy, so the beginning part again talked about the 69 weeks, 69 sets of 7, and most all conservative evangelical Christians understand that prophecy to be speaking literally about actual years, 69 sets of 7 years, and because we know that that's accurate because it predicts accurately that Jesus will come and the Messiah will come and be cut off and have nothing in 33 AD, which is what happened. So we know, okay, it must be speaking about literal years, literal sets of 7 years. So when it says in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, and this is speaking about some person, that'll be clear who he is as we get into this, but he will make a firm covenant, or he will confirm a covenant with the many for 1 week. This is that remaining 70th week of this prophecy. But in the middle of that week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even unto a complete destruction, one that is decreed and is poured out on one who makes desolate. So there's a lot of stuff in there. We're not going to get into the weeds of what all the stuff that this prophecy seems to be talking about, but there's a few things to note. We're talking about this last remaining week. So you'll sometimes hear the Great Tribulation referred to by people teaching prophecy as Daniel's 70th week. Well, this is where that comes from. It is the final 70th week of this prophetic word that was given to Daniel almost 500 years before the time of Christ. And what's interesting is that there was no temple built at this time. The temple had been destroyed by the time of Daniel, and there was no temple to be built. And he is saying in this prophecy that this future coming ruler is going to do something that will put an end to sacrifices and grain offerings. So that implies a temple is going to be rebuilt. Well, a temple was rebuilt. A temple was rebuilt shortly before the time of Jesus. The temple did exist at the time of Jesus. That's when Jesus went in and cleansed the temple, and the curtain when he died was torn in the temple from top to bottom. So there was a temple that was existing. Well, this 70th week thing, futurists, people who believe that this is happening still yet in the future for our time, believe that this is still going to happen. Well, that poses a problem because there is no temple. There was a temple in Jesus' time. That temple got destroyed in 70 AD, about 40 years after the time of Jesus, and it has never been rebuilt. For 2,000 years almost, there's been no temple, no Jewish temple in Jerusalem. So this is why you'll hear people who take prophecy literal. They knew, they were Christians before the time, 1947-48, when the nation of Israel was reborn. They were Christians who took God's word literally and said, the nation of Israel is going to be reformed. We know this because the Bible says that the nation of Israel is going to be reformed. And so they were trusting that was going to happen. And lo and behold, it did happen. So that, just as a sidebar, that's another reason why it's important to look at prophecy, not just as intellectual curiosity, and to look at it and trust that God is speaking literally, because I think a lot of the impetus for viewing prophecy almost as just like a spiritual whatever is because there's a fear that it doesn't have any application. If it's speaking about a future event, well, what does that mean for me now? Well, one of the things it means for you now is that we can see God making very literal predictions, and they literally come true the way God said they were going to come true. And that's not just intellectual curiosity. That bolsters our faith and gives us confidence. So when we're looking ahead to things that are going to be happening in the future, we have a confidence in God and in His Word that these things are going to happen. So it's a bolstering of our faith. That's why it's important, I think, to look at these things from a literal perspective. But so he says that the sacrifices and grain offerings are going to be put to an end. So we believe that this is a future event that takes place over 7 years, 1 week, the one set of 7 years. And that's where that really comes from, the 7 years. Now, there is more evidence that I want to show that seems to keep hitting over and over and over again. A 7-year period, a future 7-year period. And so let's take a look at what the Bible has to say. That passage in Daniel says in the middle of that 7-year period, that week, that set of 7, in the middle of that is when this abomination of desolation is going to take place. Well, in Matthew chapter 24, verses 16 through 17, this is Jesus talking. He's answering his disciples' question basically about the end of the world. They're saying, what's going to be the sign of your coming and the end of all this stuff. And in this chapter, Matthew 24, he says, this is verse 16, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place," let the readers understand, "then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountain." So he's assuming, let the reader understand that you understand what we just went over, that in Daniel chapter 9, there's going to be an abomination of desolation. Something's going to be so abominable, it's going to lay desolate the temple. It's going to bring sacrifices in the temple to an end. And it's going to happen in the temple. Something's going to happen in the temple, in the middle of that period. So Jesus is reaffirming that. And so that's how we know this wasn't something that happened in the past, before Jesus' time, because Jesus is saying it's still going to be in the future. Now, how do we know that this is a future event? Because some people think that this happened in 70 AD. The temple got destroyed. The Romans, with the help of some of the local, what we would call Palestinians, but local non-Jewish people in that region, destroyed the temple. Well, how do we know that this is not what's being spoken of? Well, Jesus, in the context of Matthew 24, says that this stuff happens immediately. He says immediately after the tribulation. This tribulation is when Jesus returns. So if the tribulation that Jesus is speaking of happened in 70 AD, he said immediately after that is when the Son of Man returns and comes back. Well, that didn't happen. 71, 72, 73 AD, Jesus didn't come back. So that leads me to believe this hasn't happened yet. This is still a future event. Because, I mean, look around. Do you see Jesus around here? No. And if this was what Jesus had to offer for his kingdom, I'd say, I want my money back. This is kind of crummy. But we know Jesus' kingdom is going to be perfect. It's going to be a perfect rule. So this is a future event, and Jesus reaffirms this abomination of desolation. Standing in the holy place, Jesus says. And we know this happens in the middle of that 7-year period. Okay? So it appears that the Antichrist, this person that we call the Antichrist, the Bible also refers to him as the beast, he seems to do something in the holy place in the middle or halfway point. Well, if you look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, this is the Apostle Paul, in and around probably the late 40s, maybe early 50s AD. He's writing to the Thessalonians, who are a little bit concerned. They're not sure about the end times, how everything's going to shake out. So they're afraid that maybe they've missed the day of the Lord, the coming of Christ. Maybe Jesus showed back up in Jerusalem and they missed it somehow. Well, Paul reassures them, don't let anyone deceive you. For it, that is the day of the Lord, is not going to come unless the apostasy comes first. So there's apparently going to be some great falling away of the faith that comes before the day of the Lord. He says, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who, quote, opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. So Paul's saying, don't worry, you haven't missed the day of the Lord, because this man of lawlessness has not shown up yet. And what he's doing is he's alluding to a passage in Daniel chapter 11. And so Paul, like a good Jewish man, is basing his belief about what's going to happen in the future on Old Testament prophecy. And so in Daniel chapter 11, verses 36 through 37, it says, then the king, this coming king, will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. So you can see that's what Paul's alluding to. And he will prosper until the indignation is finished. So indignation, that sounds a lot like tribulation, right? This wrathful time of period. For that which is decreed will be done. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. So Paul says that this person, this coming ruler, this king, this Antichrist figure, he does this before the return of Christ, and it sounds like this is part of what's called the abomination of desolation. Remember, Daniel says that this abomination that desolates the temple and ruins, basically brings sacrifices to an end, says it happens in the middle of the 7-year period. And Jesus says that it happens in the middle of the 7-year period, and it happens in the holy place, standing in the holy place. And so Paul says he takes his seat in the temple of God. So whatever this is, it's something that's happening halfway through 7 years, and it's happening in the temple of God. And he's boasting, he's declaring himself to be God. He's lifting himself above all gods, and we'll see he starts persecuting people too. So what have we seen? Daniel predicting literal 69 sets of 7 years, which we know that they're literal years because if you look at them as literal years, it predicts right down to the year when Jesus is going to come. So if we use logic, if the 69 sets of 7 years are literal, then the 70th set of 7 years must also be literal. Okay, and so we assume that when the Bible says things, it means what it says. It's not trying to be hidden or mysterious. It's letting us know. It's a 7-year period. And we have two passages now that say in the middle of that 7-year period, something terrible happens. And Jesus says in Matthew 24 that when you see that happen, flee to the mountains. So he's telling his Jewish audience, right? When you see in Jerusalem this person, this abomination in the holy place, get out of Dodge. Run out of Jerusalem. Flee. And this is going to happen in the middle, Daniel tells us, in the middle of 7 years. Why am I stressing in the middle? Well, you'll see. We've got about 4 or 5 passages that is significant. In Daniel chapter 7, this is another prophecy that Daniel had before the one in chapter 9, but he has this prophecy about this coming beast. And if you read Daniel chapter 7, he's this fourth beast, this terrifying beast with like 10 horns and 10 heads, and very reminiscent of this beast that shows up in Revelation, but this horrifying beast that shows up, and he desecrates the temple. He defiles the temple. He declares himself to be God, which would be certainly blasphemous. That would desecrate the Jewish temple for sure. So, in Daniel 7, he's talking about this beast who immediately precedes the coming kingdom. In Daniel 7, right after this fourth beast, then that's when the Son of Man shows up and sets up his kingdom. So in Daniel 7, verse 25, it says, he will speak out against the Most High, against God, and he will wear down the saints of the Highest One, and he will intend to make alterations in times and laws, and they, the saints, will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. Okay, so again, this sounds like the same kind of person, this coming beast who's going to be ruling right before the second coming of Christ, and he's speaking out against the Most High. He's blaspheming the Most High. Well, that's what we're told this Antichrist person is going to do. He's going to take his seat in the temple, and he's going to blaspheme against God. But what we're told here is that he's going to persecute them for time, times, and half a time. Well, that's a phrase that's going to come up later in Revelation. But what most people think that time, times, and half a time means is 3.5 years. Now, where do they get 3.5 years from? Well, think of time, singular time. It says for time, times, plural, and half a time. As a unit, 1 year would be 1 time. Times would be 2, plural, multiple years. And then half a time. So time, 1 year, times 2 year, and half a time, half a year. So 1 plus 2 plus half is 3.5 years. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what that means, but we have from Jesus, from Paul, and from Daniel, all saying that there's going to be this person, this beast figure, who will halfway through a 7-year period take his seat in the temple and blaspheme God. Well, what is half of 7 years? 3.5 years. Time, times, and half a time. Okay, that sounds relatively compelling. Well, you see that phrase come up again in Revelation chapter 12, verses 13 through 14. So there's this war in heaven going on, and the dragon, and we're told in Revelation, take my word for it, this dragon is Satan, the serpent of old, we're told. It says, the dragon saw that he was thrown down to earth. He persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. We don't have time to talk about this, but it's not even necessarily relevant to our conversation, but I believe that the woman who gave birth to the male child is the nation of Israel, so he's making war with the Jewish people. But the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place. Okay, so Jesus told the Jewish people, when you see the beast, flee into the wilderness. And so here you've got the Israelite people fleeing to the wilderness. And in Revelation 12, it says, where she was nourished for time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. Well, isn't that interesting? There's that phrase again. Time, times, and half a time. Well, if the beast desecrates the temple at the halfway point, and Jesus said, when you see that at the halfway point, flee to the mountains, and now we have the dragon going after the woman, and she flees to the wilderness for time, times, and half a time. Well, that would make sense. 3.5 years, 1 year, 2 years, half a year. 3.5 years, which would be the last half of this 7-year period. We see earlier in Revelation 12, verse 6, if the time, times, and half a time didn't quite do it for you. In Revelation 12:6, it says, then the woman, again, I think that's Israel, fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God so that she would be nourished for 1,260 days. Well, as we talked about in the earlier episode on the 69 weeks, this prophetic passage in Daniel 9, the Jewish people understood a year to be 360 days. Not 365, they weren't quite accurate, but, 12 months of 30 days in each month. 360 days, that's pretty close. Have to make a couple adjustments every year or so, but that's pretty close. So by that reckoning, 1,260 days, by my math, if you take 360 days times 3.5, you get 1,260 days. So here we have another passage that speaks of using different language but talking about the same length of time, that the woman, Israel, or some people, flee to the mountains for 3.5 years, or time times in half a time, or 1,260 days. It's all the same time period. And why are they fleeing? Because Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, in the middle of the tribulation, a 7-year period, flee to the mountains. So they flee to the mountains for how long? 3.5 years, time times in half a time, or 1,260 days. If that's not enough evidence that this is a literal 7-year period, we've got Revelation chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. Here you've got John having a vision, the Apostle John, in which he's being told to measure the temple courtyard. And it's going to be set aside for a specific purpose. This is these two witnesses that God's going to call to witness for him during this time period. And it says in Revelation 11, 2 and 3, leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it's been given to the nations. So there's the court of the Gentiles, places the Gentiles allowed to go. And it says, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. So here you have these two witnesses witnessing for how long? 1,260 days. How long is that? 3.5 years, or time times in half a time. And you have the holy city, Jerusalem, being trampled underfoot for 42 months. How long is 42 months? 12 months times 3 is 36 months, plus 6 months, a half a year, is 42. 42 months is 3.5 years. So here we've got another way of saying the same period of time. You've got a 7-year period split right down the middle that's being marked by the abomination of desolation. When that happens in the middle, flee to the mountains, get out of Jerusalem because bad stuff's going to start happening for 3.5 years, or time times in half a time, or 1,240 days, or 42 months. It's the same time period over and over and over again. And one more passage that uses the same language, Revelation 13:5. It says there was given to him, this is this beast that rises up out of the sea, this horrifying beast. It was given to him a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies. So again, that sounds a lot like this person, right? Who takes a seat in the temple, blasphemes against God, rails against the Most High. It's given him words and blasphemies and authority to act for 42 months was given to him. So again, another passage. Here's 5 passages that speak of a 3.5-year period of time, which is half of a 7-year period of time. I don't think that that's coincidental. I don't think God would repeat himself over and over and over again on something that we ought to know is a literal period of time based on the veracity and the accuracy of the earlier prophecy. The 69 weeks were literal. You take them literally, you come right down to the year in which Jesus is going to be crucified. Why would we assume that the last 7 years is not literal, especially when we have over and over and over again 42 months? Are those months symbolic or are they literal? 42 months, 1,260 days, are those days symbolic or are they literal? So over and over and over again, we see 7.5 years. So, again, why does this matter other than, more than intellectual curiosity? Well, it matters because this is God's word we're talking about. God is giving us, we said in the earlier episode about predictive prophecy, God is saying, listen, I'm going to give you a way to trust me. That is, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen in the future so that when it comes to pass, you know that it's me saying it. So when God's speaking prophetically, it's not just for intellectual curiosity. He's not speaking in riddles and mysteries. He's trying to be understood, and he's trying to speak clearly. And I don't think it's very hard to understand that a 7-year period of time split in half is 3.5 years. Or said a different way, time times in half time. Or said a different way, 1,260 days or 42 months. It says it over and over and over again, describing a period of time that immediately precedes the second coming of Christ and discusses the reign of a coming beast, ruler, king, who will in some way desecrate and defile a temple that will be rebuilt sometime in the future. He will put an end to sacrifices and offerings. He will defile that temple. He will blaspheme against God. And then he will go to make war with the saints and the people of God. It matters whether that's literal, because that's a very specific prediction that's repeated multiple times in the Bible. So I think we do ourselves a disservice, and we do God a disservice by just saying, yeah, he's just speaking about people who just blaspheme God all the time. We just kind of relegate it to the spiritual interpretation. Now, again, we have to be restrained by what the text says. I understand people get frustrated by just endless speculation about prophecy. But hopefully in walking through this, I show you that this is not just mindless speculation. We're just reading these passages straightforward based on what it seems like they're saying. Not drawing outlandish speculation. We're just concluding, well, here's what Jesus says. Here's what Paul says. Here's what John says in Revelation. It all kind of seems to be saying the same thing, describing the same event. And if we don't go beyond what the text says, we don't make foolish predictions that get proven wrong. We just predict what the text says. So that's just a way to encourage you. Prophecy is not something to be scared of or intimidated by. You can read it and maybe not fit in all the puzzle pieces, but some of them, like a 7-year period of time, coming still in the future, immediately before the coming of Christ, can be trusted. It is accurate and gives us hope that when we see that stuff happening, we know our redemption draweth nigh. So, hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope it encouraged you to dig into prophecy a little bit more. Have a good one. While Faith in Focus is a ministry of In Faith, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of In Faith as a mission.